If I'm being honest with myself, this one was kind of different to go through for me personally because it was some. I literally picked this up within a day of having finished Mass Effect Andromeda, which was a little bit of a culture shock. And I only mention that because I might be more positive on this work than I otherwise would be because of that fact. No offense intended towards Andromeda. It's just that the difference in presentation is huge. And I want to talk about that first. I've heard many people disparage the game, Witcher 3 in general, and its expansions for the fact that, oh, everyone thinks they're the most amazing thing ever when they do all the same things every other game does, right? And I think really the big difference, for me personally, is the fact that there is a tremendous amount of attention to detail. I actually have talked about this recently when I was going through the Lord of the Rings sexology, as I was going through those films. I mentioned the details, the tiny little touches, the things that are only on the screen for a few seconds, but they're there. They're there so that you, subconsciously or otherwise, recognize them, are cognizant of them, and in so doing, it makes it more believable. It fleshes it out more. It makes it stand out more than if you just saw like a standard matte painting. I've given many examples of this, but I actually have an example from this game to give you for that. There's a sequence where you can upgrade your villa, the vineyard that you're given as a result of your service to the Duchess. And okay, that's a typical housing mechanic that exists in many different types of games. However, the difference here is most of these upgrades take a day or two. Now, you can either just sit and meditate for a day and get your upgrades, or you can go off an adventure. I mean, that's basically like 40 minutes of gameplay in order to have your upgrades. But for those 40 minutes, which I remind you is actually a very small window, if you happen to come back to your vineyard during that period of time, they're building it. They actually bothered, and I want to stress this because this is not a small thing. They had bothered to have the animations for the people, the sound effects for them working on it, the new dialogue for the people who are discussing working on it, the different meshes and textures for the beams and the infrastructure and the scaffolding as they're constructing it. All of that had to be done. People had to put time and effort into something that only lasts for 40 minutes of real time, during which most players are probably either, again, meditating to get through it, or off doing adventuring stuff like roaches, and it's there. There's no reason for it. There's no purpose of it. It isn't necessary. It isn't mandatory, but it adds tremendous flavor. It is, if I may be so blunt, the difference between rations, which are designed to feed, to keep you alive, and a good meal, which is designed to be enjoyed. That, I think, is the real crux of the difference, and why I heap so much praise upon this game, and both of its expansions, most especially this one. We are seeing a clear example of the expansion effect, or whatever I'm going to start calling that here, where this is even head and shoulders above the main vanilla game. This is a phenomenal expansion with tons and tons of meat to it. You'll notice I'm going to continuously refer to it as an expansion. That's because in my mind there's no questioning whatsoever, actually, that this is in fact a true expansion, not merely a DLC. To verify what I mean by that in my terms, DLC of course is kind of an umbrella term that can refer to anything that is downloadable content, which is a gargantuan category if you think about it. But when I use the term DLC, I mean little stuff, that just little tacked on add-ons. The best example I could ever give for that is actually horse armor back in Oblivion. It gives your horse some armor. That is DLC. Whereas, to use Oblivion again, Shivering Isles is an expansion, where you really add additional new content and meat to whatever it is the game might actually be, something significant to that particular game. So it varies from game to game, but regardless, in my mind, there's absolutely no denying whatsoever that Blood and Wine is an expansion. There's a couple of decent little things at the beginning of the expansion while we're back in the north. It mentions the... I shouldn't say it mentions, it doesn't even mention it. It emphasizes by absence the wake of war and what happens to the people in the middle of a war. Now, I mention this because a lot of Witcher 3's vanilla stuff was talking about this very concept. But the best way this is emphasized here, and I love this, is first of all they talk about all these bandits who have moved in the absence of the army. So first the armies were moving through, which were causing a hell of a mess for everyone. Then the armies left, which is now causing a hell of a mess for everyone. But so these noble knights stand up and they're like, yes, we will defeat these people. And there's this great scene where the knights are literally like posturing and being like, oh, good stuff, eloquent speech. And Geralt is just standing over on the side, arms folded like, come on, guys. Then you of course defeat the bandits, and it's like, okay, good sirs of the village, no worries. The bandits have been defeated, and the villagers are still hiding in their homes because a bunch of armed knights just killed a bunch of people in the middle of their square and are probably no better. Now, they are better, we know that, but statistically speaking, that's still something to be afraid of, especially given the recent armies moving through thing I just commented on. It's a nice touch. I actually have a lot to talk about. I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead to some... I have a half page here of side content stuff I want to just kind of mention. And then we'll go back to, effectively, a whole page of just main content stuff. So, first of all, once again, I reiterate my comment that these games... this game, the three Witcher 3 games, are far more suited to lore run material than rumination material. There's not much I can discuss about, say, for example, the statue quest. And I'm going to say it that way. Some of you know what I'm talking about. For those of you who don't stress it. But I can't really discuss much in a rumination format about the statue quest. I can showcase it while we're going through a lore run, and we can all have a laugh and enjoy it live, but I can't really talk about it other than the fact that I was just... and then we have to... and then it works! It actually really was enchanted. I mean, just... how do you do that? How do you enchant that? Just... There were some really good quests in this game, though. There's a lot of Dragon Quest syndrome in this game. Now, I'm going to define that, because it doesn't come up a lot. It's very common to the Dragon Quest series. Dragon Quest syndrome is when you present something as if it's silly, or lighthearted, or happy, and in fact it is immeasurably dark. I call that Dragon Quest syndrome because that's, in my opinion, the hallmark of the Dragon Quest series. And then the little slimes and happy-faced people and light colors and bright. It's like a cartoon, right? Except if you've actually played any of the Dragon Quest games, but especially, say, 5 or 7, you know how incredibly dark those games are, with themes of abandonment and tragedy, like true classical Greek tragedy, and child enslavement, and murder, and the death of entire nations, and societies collapsing thanks to cultural rot, and just all sorts of very serious, very dark tones are underneath this kind of cartoon. I felt that way a lot about several of the side quests in this game. 3 come to mind immediately: the White Quest, the Roach Quest, and the Camera Quest. All 3 of those were kind of, presented in a fairly lighthearted and silly manner, except for the fact that when you sat back and thought about it, it's like, well, hang on a second. There's this great part where this knight, who is currently cursed, is telling you his story, and it's this fairly unpleasant, horrible story, and he wasn't exactly a good guy, and he's begging for forgiveness, blah, blah, blah. And as he's talking on, the camera occasionally cuts back to Roach and Geralt. And, Roach is like, just kind of trailing off, and Geralt looks at him and is like, hey. It doesn't say anything. It's all body language. It's just, hey, pay attention. Come on. And then later on, Geralt, he's still talking, and Geralt's like, oh my god, and Roach is like, hey, pay attention. Little stuff like that. And, of course, Roach's dialogue was great. Roach's voice, they picked the perfect voice actor for Roach. I cannot possibly praise Roach's voice actor enough. And the Camera Quest, oh yes, here's this silly fopster of a rich man whose biggest problems is that he's bored of the fact that of nobility life. And I you know what that's like. I imagine roughly 100% of the people watching this video right now understand what it's like to look up at rich people and rich people problems and roll your eyes, right? And then we find out that the whole reason he's actually doing this whole thing is for his daughter, who is bedridden and will be for her whole life, thanks to her being completely crippled. And he is going off and gathering all these pictures and taking the paintings of them and getting the supplies to give his daughter some semblance of a life. That just came out of nowhere and just nailed me after this whole quest of just just damn it. Very much Dragon Quest syndrome. Loved it. It also ties into one of the main themes of this work as a whole, which is being in over your head. It's a very common, prevalent, near constant, I would say, theme in most of the side quests, and especially in the main quest. There are several characters who demonstrate a degree of, I want to say, lack of understanding. Is actually I want to say that a lack of proper comprehension. They don't really understand the consequences. They don't really understand what they're doing. They don't really understand who they're dealing with. That kind of a thing. And in many cases, we see this place is almost innocent. I compared Toussaint actually to the Shire many times. To explain what I mean by that, for those of you not aware, the Shire in many works, most notably Lotro is probably one where it's actually demonstrated the best in my opinion, but in many works, the Shire is this amazing place, right? It's basically paradise. And the people there have their own problems. You know, they have to worry about what they're going to wear tomorrow. They have to worry about, well, am I going to have enough potatoes to cook into a stew and a pie for my guests if they're going to visit tomorrow? I mean, these are just huge, tremendous problems that the people in the Shire have to deal with. They even have their own police force, the Bounders. You know what they have to deal with? Dogs. Occasionally a wolf. A wolf. Now think about Middle-earth and the nightmarish things that exist in Middle-earth, and then compare the Shire to that. Now, I'm not trying to say the Shire doesn't have problems. I personally think that variance and perspective matter when it comes to severity of a problem. I'm not saying their problems don't matter. What I'm trying to say is that they are so utterly innocent because there is a group of people, namely the... I still can't think of their names. The Great Company, God, and the Rangers, there we go, the Rangers and Gandalf spend a huge amount of time actively maintaining the Shire and its boundaries and ensuring that the horribleness in the rest of Middle-earth doesn't start encroaching in so they can have their little paradise. From what I understand, Toussaint, which is a vassal state of Nilfgaard, basically has the same thing in the form of the Nilfgaard Imperium. The fact that they can just kind of chill. And the biggest things they have to worry about are the occasional monster, which is not even a big deal, and, you know, what they're going to wear to the ball tomorrow, that kind of a thing. And I loved it. I really did. I fell in love with this place. As weird as that sounds, because, like, me personally, I probably wouldn't get along well with most of the people there because I prefer to be honest and overt, you know, the Skellige thing, as I mentioned earlier. But I loved the naivete, the innocence, the low scale of it. It was like going from, you know, oh, we must fight the rankers and death and star destroyers, and hang on, we're going to go to this new planet where the worst thing we have to deal with is Jawas. You know, it's just such a shift. I loved it though. Let's talk about okay, so another thing they do in several side quests while we're talking about that is what I usually refer to as lower decks. The lower decks perspective. The lower decks is an episode of TNG where it's a completely normal episode. Like, it's a completely standard episode in every way. It's practically textbook as far as a TNG episode. However, it is done from the perspective of random nobodies, lower decks crewmen, who don't know everything that the bridge crew know. So all of a sudden, a completely bog-standard episode becomes amazing because of the perspective shift. And some good effort and attention to detail was put into that episode to really make it work as well. We see a lot of that in some of the side quests in this one, but probably my favorite is actually the Roach quest, which is basically a completely standard, you know, we have to figure this out quest. It's just kind of, Roach is basically the one doing the quest, which led me to a fun little bit of headcanon that is so amusing to me, I have decided I'm going to just picture it as such in the future. See, for those of you not aware, I had to cheat my way through The Witcher 3 in order to be able to finish it on time. Go ahead, make fun. It's okay. I don't mind. In defense of myself, my save was over 90 hours for all three games. That's one playthrough. For all, and when I say all three games, I mean Witcher 3, Heart of Stone, and Blood and Wine. I basically think of them as separate games. But that's a 90-hour save for all three of those with cheats. So I made the right call on that one. But anyways, occasionally I would have to cheat in money, right? Well, it's okay, because what was actually happening is Roach, who I usually don't actually use because of, you know, the mount, dismount, terrain problems, I was just like, all right, Roach, go off. And Roach would go off and quest for me and complete Witcher contracts for me and bring in, you know, thousands and thousands of gold so I could continue to fund my main adventures. There's this wonderful sequence that I don't think any actual quest leads you to. It just kind of evolved naturally because I wanted to showcase something. I was doing this live on stream. I went to the main city, Duclon, I think? God, I actually don't remember the name of it. And I started in the city. Now, I want to tell you it from my perspective, and then I'm going to correct myself because I was wrong. So I was walking through the city, the main central hub of the city, and I was walking through and just admiring the architecture and the people walking around. Again, attention to detail was through the roof. And in many ways, they did something very, very right. And it's hard to explain properly because what they did was they took the same underpinnings of what they did in most of the other major cities in Witcher 3. However, they presented it from a different perspective. It made it feel like you were in a different culture. It made you, the player, feel like you had actually traveled to a new place. Even though there were familiar sights and familiar concepts like trade and merchants and people walking around, I'm not going to go into all the details, but there were several familiar concepts, and yet all of it was presented as if it was a completely new area. And I loved that. And I loved walking through there and adoring it. Now, here's where I was wrong, because I thought I was walking through the main city center. Turns out I was walking through the slums. I was so used to how cities looked back in the north that I thought this was the city center. It turns out it's the slums. So you go a little bit further up the hill, and the music naturally shifts. The background noises naturally shift to a completely different thing. And suddenly you're in the higher nobility city, which is completely different in tone, in visual presentation, in who's walking around, in the outfits they're wearing, in the activities they're doing, everything. The literal animations of people walking around is different in certain respects when you're in the noble area of the city. And I was just like, oh my God. And I just sat and walked through the city for a while, absorbing it all and just looking around and soaking in the details. And then you go further up, go across the bridge up to the actual castle, and then it shifts in tone again. Music dies down. Noise dies down. People are suddenly talking in muted, quiet tones, and there's a lot less people who are a lot better dressed, and there's a lot more space. Space, of course, being one of the ultimate expressions of luxury when it comes to a setting in general, actually. And so, wide open areas, large arches. It felt like it was an elven castle, so it kind of fits. But it felt like this fairy tale castle of the upper crust of nobility, and the way that they do all of that. It's never really highlighted. They never shine a spotlight on it. It's just if you walk from the bottom of the city to the top, you will soak in all of these little details. And I encourage you, if you've never done it, to do exactly that. It was a treat. And that goes back to what I meant about the details earlier, about that attention to detail, the feast, as opposed to the rations. Speaking of which, there's a lot of body language, wonderful body language in several of the quests. Probably my favorite example, I've actually referenced a couple already, but my favorite example is the tournament quest with Vivienne and the Harpy Curse. I can't believe I remember her name. I didn't even write it down. I didn't write his name down either because I never caught it, and I couldn't remember how to pronounce it. Bragwin suggests I call him Googly Eyes. But there's wonderful body language. There's, in just about every scene, the contrast between Geralt, the clear elder in the situation, and Googly Eyes, who's anxious and doesn't know what to do with his hands and is constantly trying to posture and fret. And of course, even Vivienne herself feels like she's a taut wire who's like barely controlling herself. In a lot of the main quest stuff, they do this with the Duchess as well, Henrietta, where she always has to. There's something to paunch society where you have to always use your hands in a certain way. Not the EA thing, but you need to have your hands in a certain way. They need to move in a certain way, that kind of a thing. And she does this a lot. But she, through her body language, conveys someone who is constantly trying to express discipline and holding herself back. I think I'll talk about that now, even though that's actually part of the main quest. There's a bit later. Where is that? There's a wonderful bit. You know what? Why don't I go ahead and just get to that later? Let's go ahead and finish. Do I have anything else to talk about here? Yes, I do have two more things to talk about in side quests. We'll get to that in just a bit. So there's also one other thing really quick about the tournament quest. Probably one of my favorite parts of the tournament quest is the fact that the whole time I was making fun. Anybody who saw the stream can tell you this. I was making fun of Googly Eyes. for the fact that he was just an idiot who was practically a stalker and didn't actually know this woman who he professed to love at all. All of that kind of halted when he gave this speech to Vivian. He talked about his aunt and how his aunt was stricken with disease and how she couldn't actually move or function the way she normally could, and how he would go out of his way and he and his family would try to help her and to engage her and to keep her alive. It suddenly was just wow, because all of a sudden I realized that he actually did have at least a glimmer of understanding of what he was talking about, of what she was going through. And then there is this wonderful bit later, like just a few minutes later, as you're actually going to the well, assuming you, the pond, assuming you actually decide to go through with it, where she asks him, "What happened to your aunt?" And he says, very quietly, "She died." It's a nice touch. Now let's shift that completely. I was going to bring up the Gwent quest, the opposition to new faction thing, but I realized that I probably don't have to, because most people watching this are probably gamers in some respect or another. I can't even begin to name how many games across the years I've seen that exact thing. No new factions, no new cards. I've seen that in Magic the Gathering. I've seen that in Warhammer 40k. I've seen that in D&D in every edition that I've been around to really pay attention to the meta for. I've seen that in video games. It's a common thing. Oh, don't change things. It's probably one of the reasons why StarCraft Remastered isn't changing the gameplay. No new gameplay. That kind of a thing. But I want to talk also about the bureaucracy quest. There's a quest where you have to go to the bank to get some money out. This quest, you could tell some real effort was put onto it, because it is basically perfect. First of all, one of the things they do very, very well in Witcher 3 is sound design. Both the music, the specific songs that play, the usage of the music and the songs that play. The White Quest is an excellent example of that, consequently, just in case anybody didn't figure out that Odim was the one behind that. But on top of that, the actual sound design, not just the music, but the specific sounds, how they're playing, the volume of the sounds, making sure one thing isn't overpowering another, and making sure it's everything is easily heard in the way it should be heard, at the time it should be heard, and the place should be heard. In other words, it's so perfectly done that unless you're paying attention, you shouldn't notice it. A very high mark of good sound design. In the bank quest, in the bureaucracy quest, as I wrote down here, the sound design is perfect because the music cuts out. And there's several scenes where all you hear is the slow creaking of a chair in the background, or maybe someone shuffling uncomfortably in his armor. That kind of a thing, right? And it is absolutely perfect. It perfectly gets across that feeling that I'm sure several of you have actually had in real life of sitting and waiting in line at the DMV or whatever, right? Sitting in an office just waiting for your turn. Heck, I've actually had that exact same feeling in banks before, so that's not exactly unusual to me either. And the best part, the reason I say it's perfect, is you might think, well, that sounds irritating. They don't drag it on too long. There are effectively two scenes that do the silence trick. I mentioned the awkward silence thing, and they let it run around so that you go here, nope, you go here, nope, you go here, nope, you go here, nope. 4 times you fail. Or actually, that's not true. Excuse me. 3 times you fail. If it had gone on too much longer than that, the player, the person playing the game, might have legitimately started to get irritated, for the same reason that Geralt was getting irritated, because of the bureaucracy loophole. So then they start throwing things at you. You can play Gwent. You can go fight a guy outside. You can choose to talk your way through this situation. You start interacting with the dwarf, etc., etc. And so they give the player things to do to make sure that the player doesn't get bored, while at the same time re-emphasizing the fact that Geralt is bored out of his mind. In other words, they do what so much of fiction fails to do. I'm just going to talk about this briefly, because this is a problem I've seen in many different works of fiction. Sometimes a work of fiction wants to irritate you, for example. Well, what they do is they demonstrate that irritation directed at the viewer or the player. And so it's irritating, because they're being irritating on purpose. What is much trickier to pull off is demonstrating irritation without irritating the viewer or the player. Here is an irritating character without leaving them on screen for too long, or without going overboard with the irritation. So we get, okay, that's an irritant, but we're not actually going to be interacting with them long enough to be irritated ourselves personally in real life. But we can sympathize with the characters when they interact with that character and understand that they're irritating. It's a very fine line, and it's a very difficult balance to pull off. And I wanted to give praise to the bureaucracy quest because it manages that perfectly. We get the impression, we get the feeling of how Geralt is just crawling out of his skin, like, oh, come on, why is this taking so long? Without us having to actually sit there and take so long. It would kind of be like the best way to explain what I'm talking about is to explain how they would do it wrong. Imagine if we actually had to sit there and wait for 5 minutes, in-game, real time, just sitting there, wait, can't meditate, can't do anything. A 5-minute unskippable cutscene. Now, 5 minutes probably doesn't sound like a long time, but I want you to picture 5 minutes of I'm not going to keep doing it, but you get the idea, right? That would grow very irritating and very frustrating to the player. And a lot of fiction does that, because they don't know how else to get it across to the player or the viewer. So very, very huge kudos. So, let's shift over to the main quest stuff. Toussaint is beautiful. Oh my god, it's so gorgeous. I actually have managed to get some footage of it, which I'm going to start using for some of my backgrounds, actually. Not just of Toussaint, but Witcher 3 in general. But this is our prototype. Tell me what you think of it. I'm rather pleased with how it turned out, personally. It's absolutely gorgeous. They actually literally changed the color value. I don't know what to call that. The blues are slightly different blues in Toussaint than they are elsewhere. They do different things with lighting filters, that kind of a thing. Color filters, that's where I was going with that. And it literally looks more like this fairy tale land. And it is absolutely freaking gorgeous. And of course, everyone there, even the basic peasants and serfs, wear different outfits. Slightly different, but still different than what everyone else wears. And I love it. I wanted to soak up this place so much. One other thing, too, I made a note here. Toussaint feels like a place that has reached the civilization step. Because one of the reasons why I decried the North so much was because it's basically still in your typical feudal state. It hasn't actually developed past that. It hasn't actually moved on past, people constantly living terrible lives while everyone around them is constantly making those lives worse by constantly going after them. The turmoil of early tribal years, basically, as we're just starting to move past basic clans and tribes and moving up towards, something more organized. Toussaint is an insight into what it's like when you've gone past the tribal phase, past the feudal phase, and have basically reached the first steps of what most people would refer to as civilization. Still issues, of course. This is not perfect. This is not paradise. It is just moved past most of the issues that the feudal stage and the tribal stage already had. Now, I also mention this because there's several people who will complain about things, just random NPCs walking through the streets. And their complaints are valid. Again, I'm not trying to say that, you don't know what real hardship is like. But the hardships they complain about are still, when directly compared, just not the same as the hardships that the peasantry and the serfs back in the north were feeling. The things that they were going through is so much worse than the things that these people are going through in so many different levels. This also kind of comes through in the monster thing. There's actually a great line where they talk about, don't you have monster hunters? Don't you have that kind of thing? Apparently, they just don't have nearly as much of a monster problem in Toussaint. And this even gets across in the gameplay. Very, very rarely did I have to fight, like in the north, especially everywhere. There's we've got these monsters and drowners over here and neckers over here and griffins all over the place. Non-stop problem with monsters, just everywhere, right? In Toussaint, there are monsters, but the degree of them, the percentage of them is so much smaller, and probably helps to contribute to that feeling of this place being, for lack of a better term, safer and more innocent. And of course, they also have an order of knights, and this is actually a nice bit of gameplay and story integration. There's a guy who will pay you for going and doing points of interest, those little question marks in the map. He will pay you out of the ducal treasury. Because, and the reason I say this is gameplay and story integration is he will pay anybody who goes around and does those things. In other words, people get paid to run around and help people in this area. Think about that. Think about how severely different that is. For those of you who don't fully follow the Witcher series, even just in the games, you get the very strong impression Witchering doesn't exactly pay a lot. You're usually just scraping by, just barely, in order to be able to afford your components and materials. These non-Witchers are being paid to go basically do Witchering work. It's a nice touch. There's a lot of pomp and circumstance. There's this... there's a whole emphasis on appearance. Now, what I find interesting about that is, despite the fact that they constantly refer to that, and there's so many examples of this, the masks they wear, the different types of speech they have to do, the hand thing I mentioned earlier, the fact that there's certain protocol and etiquette depending on who you're talking to. You're supposed to talk to this person with this tone, and this person with this tone, and so forth and so on. Despite all of that, what I found interesting is that most of the people in Toussaint were actually genuinely nice and actually respectful, even grateful in many times. It was such a weird shift compared to everywhere else, basically. And again, I think that's probably mostly due to the whole... Well, I know this sounds weird to present it this way, but it's the in-over-your-head thing. In other words, these people don't actually comprehend what it would be like to be truly belligered, which is funny, beleaguered, excuse me, given what happens later. But I guess what I'm trying to say is they don't have enough cynicism and experience, born of cynicism, to be rude, crude, unpleasant, and generally, that kind of a person. And this is constant throughout the whole expansion. I have a note here. They're completely out of touch with the harsher world. Yeah, no kidding. The fight with the Shelmar actually gets that across really well. Granted, that was mostly googly eyes, but the knights in general strike me as a group of people who have very good armor, very good arms. They're well funded, in other words, but they're not what you would call experienced, and they're certainly not intelligent. I don't mean as in they're stupid. I don't mean that in that way. What I mean is they lack knowledge. They literally are ignorant of what they can or may be called to fight upon. I mean, there's even this great scene where you're walking up and there's the Shelmar, and you're like, that's a really dangerous idea. And that guy goes, yeah, I saw some other people do it. It'll be fine. Huh. I have my notes here about the Shire. I've already talked about that. The music, if I may, the music in Blood and Wine is probably the best music of the trilogy, in my opinion. And by the trilogy, I again referring to Witcher 3, Heart of Stone, and Blood and Wine. Because more than anything else, it was more noteworthy. With the exception of 2 songs in Vanilla Witcher 3 and 1 song in Heart of the Stone, I don't really distinctly recall any of the music. It wasn't bad. It's just, it was ambient. It was background, Mass Effect 1 effect. Boy, that's a weird phrase. I need to think of another way to call that. Anyways, but in Blood and Wine, there were several songs that actually... I noticed them more, and they pulled me into the work more. It was very, very well done. So then, of course, we become landed. We get a vineyard of our own. And, in fact, if you do things in a certain way, you will eventually, probably within a year, go ahead and have your own crop. Now, what's funny is I wrote a note here that said it would be awesome to retire here with Yennefer, which is who I ended up picking, thanks to viewers, or whoever. Triss, if you chose Triss. It would be awesome to retire here, because I personally firmly believe Geralt should be the first Witcher who dies in his bed comfortable, who doesn't actually die horribly at a monster's claws. Lord knows the man's earned it, in my opinion. I bring that up, though, because I wrote that down very early into the game, like pretty much as soon as I was landed, as soon as they gave me the vineyard, which actually you're seeing behind me right now. As soon as they gave me the vineyard and I started building up to it, I was like, oh man, wouldn't it be awesome if that happened? Well, funny story. That's exactly what happens. After you finish the main quest, there's one final follow-up where you go to the house, and there's a visitor there. The visitor is Yennefer, if you romanced her, Triss, if you romanced her, Ciri, if you romanced neither, and Ciri is alive, and I think Dandelion, if you romanced no one, and Ciri is dead. First of all, nice variety and making our choices actually matter, but second of all, they talk about retiring, about settling in, having a bed of my own. Geralt mentions more than once, like 4 times I think, how weird it is to have a bed that's his. just such an alien concept to someone who's been on the path for a frickin' century at this point. So, I mean, that makes sense. It's just, I love it. And I was like, let's go. Also, BB, the Major Domo, love that guy. I don't even have proper words in to put why I like him. He's awesome. I want to just heap rewards upon that man as long as he keeps my vineyard happy, because I like him. He's cool. All right. Let's talk about the Duchess. So, I very much like the Duchess as a character. She's probably the kind of person that, if I'm being honest, I wouldn't get along with super well in real life. And if I had the kind of power that I was presenting myself with as I was going through, for example, if I was, in fact, the Lich King, as I was walking through Toussaint, I have a feeling she wouldn't get along well with me either, because I don't tolerate that kind of bull when it comes to certain things. What I mean by that, she is a politician. She is a distinct, aristocratic politician, no less. You know, there's a proper order of things, and there's proper this, and yet, she doesn't BS. Like, aside from the fact that she stands on circumstance, at no point did she go into meaningless rhetoric. At no point did she start trying to talk circles around me, or try to manipulate or connive or lawyer it. She never tried to lawyer it. She never tried to pull it technically with me. She was very informative, and she was very intelligent. Now, all of this, however, was warring against the fact that she's also very emotional, and she thinks she's a big fish. Now, I'm not saying she isn't, but she isn't. She is absolutely not. I actually changed my mind in the middle of me saying that. Excuse me. She is absolutely not a big fish. She's a big fish in Toussaint. But what that means is Toussaint is a small pond, and she is a small fish in it. The moment the scope of what she is dealing with stretches beyond that little pond, she very quickly finds herself completely out of her league. Again, that theme coming in of being in over her head. And she stubbornly, consistently refuses to acknowledge or receive that. I have to convince her multiple times of what a higher vampire is and the significance of that threat. Of course I do. These people have never dealt with normal threats. They've probably never even dealt with a fiend, let alone something like a higher vampire, which is way above any of that stuff. So these people, they think, oh no, we've dealt with stuff before. We can deal with this. We've got this. There's this wonderful line where Damien says, no, you just pull a vampire out into the sunlight. Or maybe hit it with a wooden stake. And I'm just sitting here laughing. It's like, no, that doesn't work that way. And that's the best part. And yet she does eventually recognize that Geralt is not just trying to cheat her. As through all her anger, she's still like, all right, clearly Geralt's serious. He's dealing with this very, very seriously. We need to treat him seriously. And so she swallows her pride and moves through with that. I have this note here. She is very taut. She's extremely emotional, like I already said. She tries to have the emotional control that Geralt already has. Put me firmly in the camp that Geralt has emotions. In my opinion, this isn't even a debate, but I will acknowledge at least the fact that there is a debate to be had. We had several on the stream, actually, as we were going through the Witcher, the various aspects of Witcher 3. So I can at least acknowledge that there's a debate there. But Geralt, assuming I am correct and does have emotions, has tremendous emotional control. He is very disciplined. By contrast, she is not. She tries to be disciplined. She tries to demonstrate the facade of the implacable, is what I call that. She fails. I'm not calling her out on that. I'm not trying to say that this is bad. It's actually very well written, very well motion captured, and very well voice acted. Very well presented overall. But she fails at having that discipline, and she showcases this so clearly. She knows how to wield the hammer. When she is in her element, Toussaint, when she is the largest fish in her tiny pond, she knows how to act like it. But the moment things go beyond that, she tries to reach for that same level of control, fails miserably, and you could see her literally floundering. You could see her stuttering more, and she gets more unsettling with her hands, and how she's just fidgety. Because for all her pride and all her lack of experience, she is still intelligent enough, just intelligent enough to recognize that this is something that should be bowing to her and isn't. She probably doesn't fully cognizant why. She isn't probably cognizant of why it is. that this is beyond her control. But she is cognizant enough to recognize that it is beyond her control. It's very well presented. I love it. I She also has a weak point, a huge weakness. Actually, if I want to go say one other thing really quick, one of the nice things they do with her is in most of the scenes she's in, she wears a different outfit. I know that sounds like a little thing, but it's very rare, even in the Witcher 3 games, for an NPC to have multiple outfits. Most NPCs have the outfit, and that's their outfit, and that's one of the things they do to make them iconic. It's actually something most video games in general do. One character has one outfit, so it's not just their face or their hair that you recognize. The same outfit becomes iconic and therefore typical of that character, so they always wear it, right? I mean, how many times have you seen Cecil outside of his Paladin armor or his Dark Knight armor, respectively? I mean, right? So her having multiple outfits was a nice touch because it also helps to emphasize, A, her being the Duchess, but B, demonstrating more the kind of character she is and the type of wealth and power that she's accustomed to. But she does have a weak point. Sienna, her sister. I wrote down a note about politics here, and I remember what that means, but it's actually quite convoluted. See, people place a lot of emphasis on blood. Now, it's clear now, having, well after I wrote this note, having completed the game and seeing all three endings at this point, it's clear now that she genuinely loves and cares about her sister. Naively and foolishly, if I can be blunt, but still, it's present, it's there, emotional, right? And she is very clearly her weakness. It reminds me in many ways, actually, of Malfurion and Illidan. Malfurion is actually a fairly well-reasoned, intelligent individual for the most part, except when his brother's involved, in which case he just devolves instantly, right? Semi-similar here. So, here's the politics thing. A lot of people place emphasis on blood. Obviously, Henrietta does too. Keep in mind, this is a woman she's not seen for over a decade. I think 2 decades, actually, at this point. They knew each other as children, and then they haven't seen each other since. And yet she still treats her as if she's some incredibly valuable person to her. Because of blood. Now, I mention this because despite that, she should behave that way because most people place emphasis on blood. That's true in real life, actually. It has been for millennia, actually, to be blunt. People place a lot of emphasis on blood. I don't, if it's not obvious. I don't get it. But a lot of people do. And what I mean by that is, let's assume for a moment Henrietta had no personal feeling whatsoever about Sienna. Just, whatever. She would still have to pretend she did, because people place a lot of emphasis on blood. In other words, all of these horrible catastrophes and the nightmare of the Night of the Long Fangs, or whatever it's called, all of that happened because of this person. There was actually legitimate threat, as they mention, of a mob forming and storming the castle, just to go after her because of how pissed off people were about this. And that makes sense. These people have never had to deal with any of the problems of the rest of the harsher world. And then having to deal with something that is arguably worse than most of that harsher problems, that's a hell of a culture shock. So yeah, I don't actually blame them. I'm amazed there wasn't an all-out revolt. I really am. In fact, I'm going to mention something about that later. Hopefully I'll remember to do so. But I bring this up because this is a problem because she's the sister of the Duchess. And people are going to place emphasis on the blood connection there. Well, if the sister of the Duchess, if the royal line is capable of performing such acts of destruction and evil, well, maybe we need to fix that royal line problem. Maybe, and the Duchess could lose a great deal of political positioning and power in the eyes of the people because someone who happened to be related to her happened to do something horrible. And so there's many instances in which she moves to protect her sister. And again, in hindsight, there's no doubt she was doing it because of personal motivations, that weak point I mentioned earlier. But honestly, she should have been doing it for political reasons as well, which is interesting. I'm going to go ahead and bring up that point I mentioned. This is kind of skipping ahead, but it ties very much into Henrietta's character, so I think this works. So all the endings, right? The ending I got naturally, just by playing the game, was the both of them die ending, aka the quote-unquote middle ending of the three. Now, What I find interesting about that is I didn't. If the people in chat hadn't informed me while I was playing that I got the bad ending, I never would have known. Now, I know that sounds weird. And of course, a lot of people yelled at me for this, so I'm probably going to get some flack for this here, too. But I mention this because it flowed so naturally from the story. It evolved so perfectly from the themes of the story, from the being in over your head and the lack of experience, the fairy tale nature of it, and the vampire nature of it, and the themes of revenge and tragedy. It just flowed perfectly from the overall tone and work of the body that I never would have known there were other endings. I probably, in ignorance, would have never even looked up other endings because I wouldn't have assumed there were other endings. If not for the fact that people are like, ah, he got the bad ending. I actually tried to rewind time a bit to some of my previous saves and fix that. I apparently couldn't. And it turns out several people have actually done some work on figuring out exactly where the triggers are for getting the good ending. And they're vague. Because if you don't get certain triggers, other triggers don't even exist. Like, you don't even have the option to enact those triggers. And if you don't get those triggers, of course, you don't get the end trigger. So, yeah. But the reason I bring that up, it was a brilliant ending. It worked perfectly. Henrietta, of course, her final weakness, she had no idea how far her sister had sunk. Openly embracing her sister like that was immeasurably risky and stupid, and very, very in character. I would imagine Henrietta's final thoughts would have been in shock at the fact that her sister had just murdered her. Not killed, murdered her right there in cold blood. And died for her action, too. And, again, very typical, very classic style tragedy. They even do some things with the color filters in the upcoming scenes to help emphasize how horrid this event is. I bring this up, though, with regards to the whole politics blood thing, because ironically, probably one of the few things that would prevent an all-out revolt from happening in this situation, if this were, of course, a real event, would be the death of the Duchess. That kind of horrific tragedy would shock everyone back out of the previous shock. And remember, Henrietta was actually quite well beloved. She was actually very well liked by the people. So they would have forgotten their anger, and it would have been replaced by grief, and therefore ensure the continuance of the realm, and no particular peasant or nobility revolts over the incredibly nightmarish event that just happened. Here's where I'm going to say something else that's going to make me unpopular. I didn't like the good ending. I watched it on YouTube, because I couldn't get it to happen myself, but I didn't like it. I'm not saying it was badly written, quite the contrary, but it felt like a sudden left turn. Now, that does still kind of fit. It fits the whole fairy tale motif. But in my opinion, that's not the kind of style of writing that I enjoy all that much. I don't enjoy, personally. I'm not saying it's necessarily bad writing, but it seemed very jarring compared to most of the rest of what's going on. Just, there's this scene where Siviana is ranting about poor her and woe is her. And it's a scene that only happens if you've reached out to her and made her feel some semblance of remorse for what she's done. And the whole time, this woman, maybe it's just me, but this woman who has deliberately, intentionally, personally caused death and horror to many people on a large scale and individuals on a personal scale, is ranting about how unfair life is. And Henrietta, who has been a pretty awesome character, and I do like her as a character, who in addition to that has demonstrably gone above and beyond the Call of Duty many times to try and actually help people, is having to beg her for forgiveness over and over. Something about that didn't sit well with me. And then, of course, they reunite, and everything's well, and I have no idea what happened after that, actually, because, I don't know the consequences. Does she still get tried? Didn't quite sit well with me. I get it, it's the good ending, and honestly I would prefer Henrietta to live, although I actually have no idea how they're going to deal with the revolt situation if Henrietta the Beloved, who has just recently lost favor thanks to allowing this horrible situation to happen, has just forgiven the person who caused it. But Also, I saw the bad ending, the actual bad ending, which is funny because you have to go a very specific path to get it. And if you do, then, Sienna dies, as she should. And then Henrietta's like, "Ah!" And Dandelion has to try and get you out. It's just, wow. But that brings me, is that everything on? Yeah, I think that's basically everything I have to say about the Duchess. One last little point. There's a scene where she rips her skirt off in order to go riding. Now, at the time, that was probably done to demonstrate that she is a strong female character. Note the way I say that, by the way. Nowadays, in the modern era, that has actually become kind of a negative connotation. Strong female character. Because of gender politics and what is the current controversial hot-button topic. The year this video comes out is 2017, for anybody watching back with historical significance. I have no doubt that give us a few more years and we will have moved on to the next controversial topic, and this one will have faded just like all the previous ones have over the last few decades. This is a very common thing. But I bring this up because I say that as a strong female character, not a female character who's strong, which is what most people tend to write. A strong character who happens to be female is what the Duchess is presented as, which is my personal preference when it comes to that type of character. So that gets across that point. But the second point also makes sense in hindsight, because it ties back into what I mentioned earlier about her. Lack of emotional control, lack of discipline. There were many other ways she could have dealt with that situation that wouldn't have taken nearly as much time, really. And yet, in her anger, in her emotional outburst, she just ripped her dress off and was like, "Here, give me a horse!" Because she wasn't actually in control at the time. She was pissed. It's nice. So, most of the rest of my notes are about vampires. But before I get into that, there's two other, actually, things I want to talk about that aren't really vampire-related. First, I want to talk about the Curse of the Black Sun. A.K.A., I was born under these circumstances, and therefore I'm cursed to be a horrible, monstrous, evil person. What I find interesting is they never answer the question that brings up. Is that curse real? Now, keep in mind, this is the Witcher setting. Curses are real. We have seen a peasant farm boy, in anger, unintentionally curse an entire island. This is the kind of setting we're living with. So the idea that you could be cursed through no fault of your own is actually entirely feasible. And there may literally be such a curse. Lord knows, in my opinion, Sylviana was very, very evil. However, it is also entirely possible, and this is brought up again many times in the work, that there is no such curse, that people assume it through superstition. Ironically, for a setting that has real curses, magic, ghosts, witches, etc., there's also a lot of superstition, which is wrong. You can kill ghosts, or you can kill, vampires with sunlight, to name just one example. And it's entirely possible there is no such curse. Except there kind of is, isn't there? There's no magical curse at that point. Instead, that becomes a social curse, a societal curse. You are born under these circumstances, and therefore, screw you. I don't have any answers on that one. I just think it's interesting how they bring that up and never answer it. And it's up to us to decide, was she actually cursed to be this horrible person, or did she become it through the circumstances of her upbringing? Second thing I want to talk about is another theme that runs throughout this work, and it's a constant one. I call it the soldier-officer theme, because that's where it was first introduced to me, World War II specifically. I was just following orders, for those of you who don't already know what I'm talking about. It boils down, this is actually something that Mass Effect 2 brought up as well. Thane brings up this thing. Do you blame a gun for shooting someone, or do you blame the person who shoots the gun, right? And it boils down to blame, because the morals of the situation are very gray and very debatable, and the ethics are very gray and very debatable. Blame, that gets into an interesting question. The obvious answer is both people have blame. Different types of blame. The killer for killing, for following the orders, and the officer for giving the orders, right? And that's the easy answer. And yet it's still something that's brought up many times and in this work, not just in the main quest, but in a lot of the side quests as well. Someone will do something because they were ordered to, or because they were told to, or because they were expected to. And the concept is brought up, we should punish this person for being the one who did it. We should punish this person for being the one who ordered it. And it flip-flops a couple of times. Depending on who you're interacting with, changes which person the blame fits with. And you notice several of the NPCs tend to primarily fixate the blame on one or the other, emphasizing both sides of the argument, basically. And it's up to us to decide that. And again, this is actually kind of a controversial topic, too, and has been for the last 60 years. As I said, it was first brought up to me through World War II, where it came up a lot. So, no answers, again. But it once again emphasizes, for example, who's worse? Let me just give you a direct example. Detloff for murdering people, or Siviana for manipulating him into murdering people. If I may, all I will say is that there is a wonderful scene, which we see in the memory, of Detloff murdering, I forget, Delacroix, I want to say. And in fury and anger at himself for having to do it, chops off the hand that did it. He murders him with just his right hand, and then in rage chops off the hand and flings it off because he can't stand to be with the thing. It's a nice scene. And it really helped to emphasize, to flesh out Detloff's character. It's actually a damn shame because in all four of the possible paths to the ending, there's no, or yes, four, I'm right. There's no way to spare his life. Then again, does he deserve to be spared? After all, anything he did beforehand is debatable, but taking out the town, that was pretty much on him. Regis is awesome, and I want to talk about Regis briefly. So first of all, Regis through action, also the earlier Duchess kind of emphasizes this, but Regis is the perfect example of that old phrase, you know, why Geralt, at least, and most Witchers in general, from what I understand, don't like to kill monsters that can think, that can reason, that are sentient and sapient, because they aren't necessarily monsters at that point. They're just other people, right? Now, granted, Lord knows most Witchers probably couldn't take on a higher vampire, and by the way, the final boss fight was awesome. I'll get there. I'll get to it. But my point being, Regis is a perfect, demonstrable, showing not telling example of why it is Witchers have that policy. This is funny because we've actually had a similar thing earlier. There's a side quest in Witcher 3 Vanilla involving a succubi that also perfectly encapsulates that concept. No, I'm not going to kill you. You're a succubus. You talk, you think, you reason. You should leave because you're causing issues in this and this way, but I'm not going to kill you. Regis also pulls off a hat trick. One of my viewers described him as having the characteristics of a Mary Sue without actually being a Mary Sue. And I feel that this is where that all-important word comes in, presentation. I've already gushed about the presentation of this game. The sound design, the voice acting, the motion capturing, the everything. Every single tiny little sliver of this game is brilliantly presented. But Regis is probably one of the best examples I could ever use, because he should be a character that irritates the hell out of me. He is an absolutely typical immortal type character. Elf, ancient, deity, vampire, they all have the same damn trait. Oh yes, I don't understand why mortals cling to their lives so much, and oh, you petty little things beneath me, I can barely understand you. You know what I'm talking about. You've seen it a dozen times in a dozen different works, haven't you? And yet, at no point in time did Regis actually irritate me, because of how he presented himself. He came across as strangely humble, while still saying things that weren't humble. He was immensely powerful, and yet didn't flaunt that that power. He was very cognizant, very intelligent, very wise, and yet never bothered to lord that over people. His presentation, and the voice actor was perfect, by the way, made him an endearing character when otherwise he shouldn't have been. Very huge props. I love Regis. There's a great... I actually personally did the unseen vampire elder side of the quest, just to see what happens there. By the way, I just got to say really quick, they pull a hell of a hat trick. The game has a yellow dialogue options for this will advance the dialogue, and then like kind of tan dialogue options for you want more information. Now, 99.9% of the time, you pick the tans, then you pick the yellow if you want all the lore, right? Well, when you're talking to the elder, you pick a tan, he gets pissed at you, and then if you pick the other tan, he murders you, and then you have to reload a save. So I actually had to go do that scene twice to see both of the dialogue options because I wanted to. But anyways, hell of a cheat, isn't it? But when you're doing the Unseen Elders chain, there's a great part where Regis says, "Why are you still doing this? This is way beyond a Witcher contract. You are under no obligation. You can just bail right now. I have to stay. I am bound by blood to Detloff. Why are you staying?" And there's a lot of options you can pick. But my favorite one is for you. And you turn to Detloff, you turn to Regis and you say, "I'm staying for you. You're in trouble. I've already seen you die once. I don't want to see you die again." And Regis actually, for the first time, has nothing to say to that. He is completely overwhelmed by that. I love that scene. I got your back, Regis. He's awesome. He's awesome. He's also a great insight into vampire culture. So, we learn about the hyper-specialization. I postulated, again, speaking purely just from the games, about whether the higher vampires innately have greater power in, A, B, or C, or if, because they have an inclination towards something, they develop it over time and therefore become hyper-specialized in it. I asked this question of chat. Most of the people in chat said it's probably both, actually. They already are leaning towards this type of mentality or this type of ability, and then they develop it over time, becoming even better at it. And the idea is that each higher vampire is basically hyper-specialized at something. Interesting note. To my knowledge, they never actually say what Regis's specialization is, unless it's brewing mandrake brew. But anyways, they talk about the vampire world a lot, and vampire society. I find myself wondering what the vampire world is really like. There's this brilliant line, again, in the Elder Vampire chain, where Regis perfectly explains what it's like to be a higher vampire in the Witcher 3 world, in the human world. The banquet scene. He does this because this is perfect. It would be too easy to say, "Oh, it's agony, oh, it's nonstop torment." But instead he says, no. It's not pain. There's not some crisis at your door. Just imagine something where you're uncomfortable. And Geralt gives the perfect answer. I'm at a banquet in a doublet that's uncomfortable and stitched. People are talking about stupid things. The food is bad, the drink is bad, and I have to smile and nod and listen to everyone. Hate that. It's irritating. It's not bad. It's just irritating. And then Regis returns, "All right, now picture you're stuck there forever. And if you slip, they scream 'Monster, monster,' and try to rip you to shreds." It's probably the best explanation of vampire culture that I received in the entire expansion, that one interaction right there. It truly emphasizes how the higher vampires are alien from us in a way that nothing else really did. Everything else they did was fairly analogous to humanoid life, if not human life. But that one line really helped to emphasize just how uncomfortable it is for them being here, and made me feel for Regis all the more. I do wonder, though, for a species that literally needs to feed on blood, where did they get their blood from in their world? In fact, I have another thought on this, because they obviously drink blood. I mean, they drink the blood of humans all the time. In fact, they even have a dialogue bit about how child blood tastes all the sweeter, which made me kind of nauseous, even just saying that again. Blah. I would have loved to kill Oriana, by the way. Just, wow, no. I know that is actually a more gray situation. It is, legitimately. She is offering protection, food, and comfort to these people in exchange for being able to feed off them. Okay? Still want to kill you. Just saying. But I got plenty of money to fund the orphanage. I can do that part. Just, you need to go away. But no. No, what really gets me, though, is they talk about the differences in their world. They talk about how much they hate it here. They talk about how much they're always on edge. One thing I was a little worried about this because high vampires are way too high tier for this setting. This is actually kind of a problem with Gontar O'Dim as well. The Witcher setting overall is actually very low tier. I like it. I like that about it. I like the fact that it's so down to earth, so to speak. Kind of Lord of the Rings style, if you will. At least as the movies are presented. But higher vampires are fairly high tier for this setting. I would probably call them medium tier or low medium tier across all of fiction in general, but for The Witcher, they're really high tier. It is actually an amazing fact, and I love the fact that they properly emphasize how incredibly powerful a high vampire is because of all three phases of the last boss, where you finally, truly, no, really fight a higher vampire for arguably the first time in the franchise, at least as far as the games are concerned, and it's a hell of a fight. Like, even with cheats on, I went through that fight a couple of times because I did the ending more than once to see everything, and a couple of times I actually turned everything off and just tried to go at it legit, and holy hell, that fight! Yikes! Brilliantly designed, though. No artificial difficulty whatsoever, in my opinion. It's all about paying attention, maneuvering. Everything he does, you have a way to avoid or counter it. There's no such thing as a gotcha trap. There's no such thing as a meat gate. It was very genuine difficulty, and it brilliantly emphasized how insane higher vampires really are. In truth, if Detloff hadn't been so focused on killing Geralt, Geralt probably wouldn't have defeated him, ironically. It also helps to emphasize why Geralt is the top-tier Witcher, because he actually managed to take out a frickin' higher vampire one-on-one. Couldn't kill it. Regis had to do that. But he could take it out. But that brings me to my next point. There's a sequence. It's the third phase of the fight, when we're in this blood thing. I don't know what else to call it. And there's a heart thing up there, and we have to take out these pustules and constantly dodge the combos from hell from the wingless blood monster that is Detloff. Now, I have no idea what's going on in that scene. Really, I don't. But what it brings to my mind is the idea that that's kind of how the vampire world is. Bloody, I mean. I know this is getting out there, but I literally just had this mentality of, because of that earlier speech about the whole, this world is so uncomfortable for us, what if the vampire world is basically alive? What if that's where they get their blood from? What if that's how they function? We see what they look like for real. They are fairly pustulous, fleshy, bloody creatures, right? What if that's the norm for them? What if their beautiful countryside is veins and flesh and all that horrible stuff? At least what I would consider to be horrible. It's probably one of the best ways to demonstrate that alien nature, in my opinion, and would help to explain why the hell we see that scene at the end there after he bites us. I still have no idea why we see it, unless it's trying to emphasize that we have been connected to Detloff and we have to sever that connection, internally or externally. Lord knows we see some hella illusion magic in this setting, or in this game, excuse me. By the way, I'm just going to say really quick, I loved the fairy tale sequence with Sienna. I absolutely freaking loved it. I cannot even praise that enough. First of all, it looked even more fairy tale than anywhere else. One of my favorite little details is there's just castles everywhere. If you just start looking in the distance, there's a castle, and there's a castle, and there's a castle. Because it's a fairy tale, everyone's got a castle, right? And the fact that it took every little fairy tale and twisted it to make it more horrible and more dark, and it's even emphasized in lore, because this is not just the fairy tales going wrong because darkier and edgier, but it's the fairy tales going wrong because the spell hasn't been maintained for probably decades at this point. So, either way, the other thing I want to mention, though, and this is where things really get weird. This is the only bit of information that doesn't fit for me. And I'm just predicting right now, I'm going to get people who read the books are going to come in and be like, oh, it's this! Duh! Why does Detloff turn into a human male when he dies? After Regis drinks his blood, he dies, truly dies. But he doesn't cessate, which is what I was assuming was going to happen. He doesn't cease to exist. He dies, turns into a human male and dies. That was very confusing to me. I do have a theory, which I will postulate, but it also kind of helped to emphasize. Earlier I thought, if only a vampire can kill another vampire was just another example of rules magic, right? But having seen that, I think this is more of a Highlander situation. To explain a little bit, when a Highlander kills another Highlander, they basically take all of their energy, their power, for themselves. I think that what was happening here. I think Regis drinking the blood of him consumed the power that made him a vampire. And therefore, by removing his vampirism from him, he was able to die because, the vampirism is what allows them to regenerate, right? But why revert into a human? Well, here's my theory. I think higher vampires were humans once upon a time. Before the conjunction of spheres, before they ended up on whatever weird, bloody planet or whatever they were, I think vampires were an offshoot of humans. and just kind of over however many grillions of years mutated or evolved or culturally changed or all deliberately changed themselves into the so-called monsters they are. And thus, when a higher vampire is truly slain, they revert back to the default slate, aka a person, a human. That's just a theory. Otherwise, I've got nothing, because the fact that he turns into a human is actually very weird compared to every other fact we learn about higher vampires. There is a brilliant scene about where Regis... I mentioned they show and don't tell several times. There's a brilliant scene in which Regis pretty much... It's hard to explain. He does it through several different acts, but basically he subjects himself to what would arguably be the worst type of torture for him, deliberately and knowingly. Now, this demonstrates two things without having to say it, and I love it because it's a very great example of showcasing, not telling. First of all, it emphasizes how important his blood bond to Detloff is, that he's willing to go through this crap to help him out rather than to hunt him down or destroy him. But second of all, and this also really struck a chord with me, because it helped me, the player who hasn't read the books, become invested in this character. It emphasized how much he trusted Geralt. I want you to think for a moment. You don't have to do this. I won't blame you if you don't. I want you to picture whatever, like, the worst thing you can think of is that could happen to you. Something really, really horrible. I don't mean, like, children dying. I mean, like, some kind of torture, some kind of imprisonment or fate that could be put upon you that is really, really, really bad, okay? Now, I want you to imagine that you willingly put yourself into this with the trust in someone getting you out. My question to you is, how many people in your real life would you trust enough to put your fate into their hands completely, such that the only way you will ever be free from this horrific fate is if they free you from it? How many people do you trust that far? I wouldn't be surprised if there's some of you who don't trust anyone that far. I wouldn't even blame you for that. The demonstration, the sheer demonstration of Regis's trust in Geralt was powerful and really hit me there. There's a scene where the vineyard guy is charged with high treason for selling off the Sangreal. Now, I liked that because of the reason why it makes so much sense. One of the funny things, before I realized it was Sylviana, one of the funny things was that I thought this was someone who was setting themselves up to effectively rule as Toussaint without ruling Toussaint. See, this is the era of old stuff. The most common and fastest form of communication is usually a guy with a horse, right? So in that era, it's easier to send orders from the crown that are not from the crown. All you need is something that is universally recognized as from the crown. Now, usually this would take part as like a signet ring. If you get a copy of that signet ring, you can seal orders, and they'll take the orders and say, well, this has the royal seal, therefore it must be from the royal court. And you can basically rule and give orders as if you were in charge. The Sangreal functions in the exact same way, really. Now, we know in hindsight that it was just Sylviana being Sylviana, but I like the idea that they could literally use a very particular form of wine, which nobody would have access to other than the ducal court, as a way of saying, I have the ducal court's permission, here's my proof. It's the signet ring of Toussaint, and I really like that presentation, that cultural aspect. It's one of the reasons why the whole high treason thing makes a lot of sense. So then there's the sentry, and there's a great scene. There's a brilliant scene. First of all, I love the party sequence. I've loved all three party sequences in the three games. The one with Triss in Vanilla, the one with Vladimir in Heart of Stone, and the one with Oriana's estate in this one. I have nothing but praise for it. I'll just say that at the first. But I love how it ends when Detloff, Regis, and Oriana are all sitting there. And I'm like, oh, okay. That was pretty much the moment I realized Oriana was a vampire. I probably should have picked up on it earlier. But seeing the three vampires there, and a Witcher, and Henrietta, it's a brilliant scene because it's actually the first scene, truly, where Henrietta is finally in over her head. And there's this great part because the other people come in, and Henrietta reverts. She defaults to high society talk, and just starts doing what she would do as if she was in a court with other noblemen. And I love that subtle touch, because what that means is Henrietta is now defaulting to being the most powerful person at the table when she is in fact demonstrably the weakest person at the table and doesn't realize it yet. However, this is just theory on my part, but I think she was smart enough, as I mentioned earlier, to recognize that this situation had just become far more tense and far more serious, but didn't fully recognize how serious it was. In other words, like I said earlier, cognizant enough to recognize that she was in over her head, but not the reality of what that actually means or how much, and therefore tried to reassert herself. Oh yes, I am the Duchess. Let me act like the Duchess. One quick thought, really quick, about the whole fairy tale land area, while I'm thinking about it. It's mentioned it was made by an illusionist, but from what I understand, that's actually a subdimension. I just point this out because it feels so much more to me like a subdimension thing, and pocket dimensions are a thing that's been used many, many times throughout D&D style medieval fantasy, and have been used in Witcher 3 as well, and hell, Witcher in general for that matter. That was even in Witcher 1. So it's my opinion that he actually crafted this basic pocket dimension in order to function as this, not anything else. It's really impressive, I'll say that much. I wonder if they actually get rid of the thing after they're done with this, or they try to maintain it, or whatever. I mean, Yennefer would probably love to get her hands on that, for example. The Unseen Elder was interesting. I want to mention the Unseen Elder because, first of all, as weird as this sounds, I never really felt the true threat of the Unseen Elder, even when we finally went to interact with him, even when he killed me instantly. Because ultimately, I feel like they oversold him a little bit. But he was still very dangerous. But basically, what I saw was just another higher vampire, just one who is less likely to talk, basically. Even Detloff could be reasoned with and interacted with, and Regis, of course, is fine, and Oriana is fine, etc. The Elder was someone who basically just wanted to be left the hell alone. Go away, was all he cared about. And yet, I will give huge praise to the Elder in the presentation of that area. First of all, for actually showing a conjunction of Sphere's spot and his whole, oh, the gate will be awoken. But second, how we convince him to help us. We don't plead to his conscience. We don't care about his morality. We don't say you're at risk. We do what everyone does when it comes to the expression of political power, not personal power. And I love the fact that we cannot personally, we literally can't fight him. If we could, I probably could beat him, because I had cheats on. I could probably beat him without cheats, too, because if you're presenting a boss fight, you're doing so with the intention of the player usually being able to defeat it in some way or another. But we never actually have the option to fight him. He's purely a cutscene fight. So we can't best him through personal power, but we can best him through political power. Because what political power really boils down to, not just the interactions between people or convincing others of other things, it boils down to what you care about. We can't kill you. We can't even hurt you. You will annihilate anyone we send after you. But there's something you care about, Elder. You care about this cave. You care about your gateway spot. You care about this place which might someday rejoin you to your planet. Or at the very least, as Regis says, offer you a hint of where you came from. You care about that. And we can take that away from you. You may be able to kill us by the dozens, scores of us, our best champions, our greatest mages. But we can take that away from you, and there's nothing you can do to stop us. And that's how we convince him, through political power, not personal. Very nice touch. I don't actually have any more thoughts here. I already talked about the ending, and the coda, and the side quests. This was an absolutely brilliant game. I can't wait to play it again, to be blunt. I probably never will, I'll never have time, but I absolutely would love to. This is a huge, huge treat, and thank you for allowing me to go through all 3 of the Witcher 3 games over the last, 90 frickin' hours of gameplay. I hope to see you guys next week, where we're going to be going through a slightly different game. If you look at the website, you already know what it is. Otherwise, I'll see you next time, guys.